If you watch how Gen X communicates, you'll notice something almost invisible. They don't reveal much. They answer the question. They move on. They don't volunteer context unless it's necessary. Now watch a millennial in the same situation. They explain where they were, why they said it, what they meant, what they didn't mean, how they hope it wasn't taken the wrong way. And sometimes, they share more than the situation required. Here's the tension. Gen X sees that and thinks, that's oversharing. Millennials see Gen X's silence and think, why are you being vague? Both think the other is socially off, but neither realizes they were trained in completely different communication climates, and that difference runs deeper than personality. It's exposure. Gen X grew up where privacy was default. If something embarrassing happened, it faded. If you made a mistake, it stayed local. If you said something awkward, it wasn't archived forever. Silence wasn't suspicious. It was normal. Now contrast that with millennials. They grew up when everything could be screenshotted, recorded, shared, replayed. Your reputation wasn't just social, it was searchable. That changes how you speak. When exposure becomes permanent, explanation becomes protection. And this is where people get uncomfortable. Millennials don't overshare because they're dramatic. They overshare because they're preempting misinterpretation. They clarify tone. They clarify intention. They clarify context. Not because they love talking, but because silence feels risky. Gen X doesn't feel that same risk. To them, fewer words equals control. To millennials, fewer words equals misunderstanding. And that creates friction in subtle ways, at work, in relationships, in group chats. A Gen X manager might say, just handle it. A millennial employee might respond with 3 paragraphs explaining exactly how they'll handle it and why. The Gen X manager thinks, why all the detail? The millennial thinks, I'm being thorough. But underneath that exchange is something deeper. One generation learned that saying less protects you. The other learned that saying more protects you. And once you see it through that lens, the behaviors stop looking emotional. They start looking adaptive. But here's where it gets more interesting. Oversharing and over-explaining aren't the same thing. They look similar, but psychologically they come from different pressures. If we don't separate them, we miss the real reason millennials talk differently. In the next section, we're going to break down what permanent visibility does to the brain and why one generation learned to manage perception more aggressively than the other. Because this isn't about confidence, it's about conditioning. And once you understand that conditioning, you start noticing it everywhere. Here's where the surface explanation stops working. This isn't just about growing up online, it's about what constant visibility does to your nervous system. When you grow up knowing your words can be archived, forwarded, or screenshotted at any moment, your brain adjusts. You start managing perception automatically. You anticipate how something might be interpreted before you say it. You add context before someone can misread it. You soften tone before someone can assume intent. That's not personality, that's conditioning. And millennials were conditioned in public. Gen X wasn't. Gen X made mistakes in rooms. Millennials made mistakes on timelines. That difference matters, because once your brain learns that visibility is permanent, it becomes hyper-aware. Psychologists call this reputational vigilance. It's the constant monitoring of how you might be perceived, and it changes how you communicate. You don't just speak, you edit in real time. You don't just share information, you manage interpretation. This is where oversharing starts to blur into over-explaining. When you feel watched, silence feels dangerous. If you don't clarify, someone might assume the worst. If you don't explain, someone might misread your tone. If you don't add context, someone fills in the gaps, so you close the gaps yourself. And from the outside, that looks like too much. Too many words, too much detail, too much emotional transparency. Gen X sees it and thinks, why are you volunteering all that? But millennials aren't volunteering. They're preventing. Preventing misunderstanding. Preventing narrative drift. Preventing reputational damage. Now the tension sharpens. Gen X developed a different survival skill. not transparency, compression, fewer words, less exposure, minimal elaboration. In a pre-digital world, brevity protected you. If something wasn't said, it couldn't be replayed. If something wasn't explained, it couldn't be dissected. Silence was insulation, so when a Gen Xer sees detailed explanation, it feels unnecessary. When a millennial hears a short answer, it feels evasive. Both think they're socially competent. Both think the other is inefficient. And that's where generational frustration builds. But here's the uncomfortable part. Millennials don't explain just for clarity. They explain because ambiguity feels threatening. They've seen screenshots circulate, group chats explode, posts resurface years later. Their brains learned control the narrative early. That instinct doesn't switch off. It shows up in work emails, relationship conversations, simple text messages. You say, "Sorry if that sounded harsh." Even if it didn't, you add, "Just to clarify." Even if no one asked, you explain the reasoning before anyone challenges it. The more public your formative years were, the stronger that reflex becomes. Now compare that to Gen X. They didn't grow up performing identity for an audience. They didn't have to narrate their thinking constantly, so they're comfortable leaving blanks. They assume good faith. Millennials assume scrutiny. And that creates a powerful divide because what one generation experiences as overexposure, the other experiences as undercommunication. Neither side realizes they're responding to different levels of perceived risk. But here's where it flips. Oversharing isn't always weakness. Silence isn't always strength. Communication styles don't just protect you, they shape how powerful you appear. In many professional environments, the person who speaks less appears more certain. Short answers feel decisive. Minimal elaboration feels confident. Gen X learned that early. Authority is quiet, but in a world that expects transparency, saying less can look like withholding. Detached, unapproachable, evasive. Meanwhile, millennials explain reasoning, narrate process, share context, and that builds something Gen X sometimes underestimates. Trust. When people understand your thinking, they feel included. But here's the uncomfortable truth for millennials. Explaining everything can dilute authority. The more you justify, the less certain you can appear. The more you clarify, the more it can signal doubt. Not always, but often. And that's where misreading happens. Gen X looks at millennials and thinks, they're unsure. Millennials look at Gen X and think, they're closed off. Both are partially wrong, both are partially right. Oversharing reduces ambiguity, but ambiguity is where leadership lives. Leaders don't explain every layer, they hold space, they set direction, they tolerate some misunderstanding. At the same time, silence can create suspicion. When people don't understand your thinking, they invent it, and invented narratives are rarely flattering. So, what happens when these styles collide? In relationships, millennials push for clarity. Gen X pulls back for autonomy. One sees depth, the other sees pressure. In leadership, millennials over-contextualize. Gen X under-contextualizes. One appears overly careful, the other overly rigid. If you're Gen X, you might be thinking, people today just talk too much. If you're a millennial, you might be thinking, people back then avoided hard conversations. Both feel true from the inside, but neither style is inherently stronger. They're optimized for different risk environments. Millennials were trained in reputational risk. Gen X was trained in interpersonal risk. Millennials fear misinterpretation. Gen X fears overexposure. And once you see that, the conflict becomes less personal. Here's the final twist. The generation that adapts best won't be the one that talks more. And it won't be the one that talks less. It will be the one that knows when to do each, when to explain, when to hold back, when transparency builds influence, and when restraint builds authority. Because oversharing without boundaries erodes presence. Silence without context erodes trust. And that tension, right there, is why this divide feels so charged. Not because one side is wrong, but because each side mastered a different survival skill, and now they're working in the same room.